Number 1. Jon Koppenhaver, also known as War Machine. In the world of mixed martial arts, stage names are common. Fighters rebrand themselves to sound more intimidating, more marketable. But when Jon Koppenhaver legally changed his name to War Machine in 2008, few could have predicted how tragically prophetic that choice would become. War Machine wasn't born a villain. Growing up in California, Jon Koppenhaver showed early promise as an athlete. He discovered mixed martial arts in his teens and quickly developed a reputation for his aggressive Muay Thai-based fighting style. By his early 20s, he'd earned a spot on the Ultimate Fighter reality series and eventually fought for both the UFC and Bellator promotions. To fans, he was brash, controversial, and undeniably talented. But behind the bravado, a darker pattern was already emerging. His first brush with serious consequences came in 2007. After a parking lot altercation turned violent, he was convicted of striking a man and rendering him unconscious. The courts handed him probation and community service, a warning shot he seemingly ignored. Another bar fight in 2010 landed him behind bars for a year. The UFC had seen enough. They cut him loose. But War Machine wasn't finished fighting. He just took his battles outside the cage. By 2014, he was in a relationship with Christy Mack, an adult film performer whose stage name matched his own appetite for attention. The relationship was volatile from the start. Friends later described it as a cycle of intensity, jealousy, and control. When they broke up that summer, most assumed they'd both move on. They were wrong. August 8, 2014. Shortly after midnight, War Machine arrived unannounced at Mac's Las Vegas home. She wasn't alone. When he discovered another man there, a friend named Corey Thomas, something inside him snapped. What followed was nearly 2 hours of unimaginable violence. Thomas was beaten severely before managing to escape. Mac wasn't so fortunate. War Machine subjected her to a prolonged and brutal assault that left her with 18 broken bones, a ruptured liver, missing teeth, and injuries that required extensive reconstructive procedures. At one point, she believed she was going to perish. When he finally left, she managed to reach a neighbor who called for help. The investigation moved swiftly. Mac's injuries told a horrifying story, and Thomas corroborated the timeline of events. But War Machine had vanished. For 6 days, he was a fugitive, sparking a multi-state manhunt that captivated media outlets nationwide. He was finally apprehended at a hotel in Southern California, ending a desperate flight from justice. The legal proceedings were exhaustive. Prosecutors filed 29 charges, including attempted termination of life, kidnapping, coercion, and battery. War Machine's defense team tried to paint a different picture, claiming mutual combat, suggesting exaggeration. But the evidence was overwhelming. Medical records, photographs, testimony from Mac herself, who bravely took the stand despite the trauma, painted an undeniable portrait of premeditated brutality. In March 2017, the jury deliberated and returned with convictions on most counts. They deadlocked only on the 2 attempted termination charges, but it hardly mattered. June 5, 2017. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Alyssa Kadish announced the sentence, 36 years to life in Nevada State Prison. War Machine would be eligible for parole in 2053 when he turned 71 years old. As the sentence was read, Christy Mack wept, telling the court she still feared for her existence if he ever walked free. War Machine himself offered words of remorse, referencing the late NFL player Aaron Hernandez, and suggesting he'd considered ending his own life. The judge remained unmoved. Today, Jon Koppenhaver sits in a Nevada correctional facility, his fighting days long behind him. The man who once sought glory in the Octagon will spend the majority of his remaining years behind bars, a cautionary tale of unchecked rage and the devastating consequences when violence leaves the cage. But War Machine's story is just the beginning of a disturbing pattern within combat sports. Number 2. Joe Son. Sometimes the most disturbing criminals hide in plain sight, playing villains on the big screen while concealing far worse demons in real life. Joe Sun's story is a chilling reminder that Hollywood's bad guys are just pretending until they're not. Born in South Korea in 1970, Joseph Hyungmin's son immigrated to California as a young child. He grew up immersed in martial arts, eventually founding his own style called Jo Sun Do and earning a third-degree black belt in Taekwondo. When the Ultimate Fighting Championship launched in the early 90s, offering brutal no-holds-barred competition, Sun saw an opportunity. In 1994, he entered the Octagon at UFC 4, billed as the creator of his own fighting system. The bout became infamous, but not for the reasons he hoped. After being taken down, his opponent Keith Hackney delivered repeated strikes to Sun's groin, which were entirely legal at the time. Sun eventually submitted to a choke, humiliated and defeated. He'd compete 3 more times in various promotions. He never won a single professional fight, retiring with a 0-4 record. But Sun found a different kind of spotlight. In 1997, he landed a memorable role in the spy comedy Austin Powers, International Man of Mystery, playing Random Task, a parody of the James Bond henchman Odd Job, complete with a deadly shoe-throwing gimmick. For a brief moment, Joe Sun was recognizable, famous even. Then he faded from view, appearing in a few more low-budget action films before disappearing entirely from the entertainment world. Most assumed he'd simply moved on with his life. The truth was far more sinister. Christmas Eve, 1990. A young woman was walking her dog in Huntington Beach when a vehicle pulled alongside her. 2 men emerged, one brandishing a firearm. What happened next was a nightmare that would haunt her for decades. She was forced into the car, driven to a remote location, and subjected to hours of unthinkable violence. The perpetrators threatened her life repeatedly, ensuring she couldn't see their faces or learn their true identities. When they finally released her, tossing her from the vehicle with only a jacket, one of them mockingly wished her Merry Christmas and told her to run. She survived, but the trauma left deep scars. The case went cold. No suspects, no leads. Fast forward 18 years. In May 2008, Joe Sun found himself arrested for an unrelated incident, felony vandalism. It seemed minor, almost trivial. As part of his probation agreement, he provided a DNA sample, standard procedure for convicted felons in California. That sample was entered into a database, where sophisticated algorithms began searching for matches against unsolved crimes. Weeks later, investigators made a stunning connection. Sun's DNA matched biological evidence collected from the 1,990 assault evidence that had been carefully preserved for nearly 2 decades. The arrest shocked those who remembered him from Austin Powers. Prosecutors initially filed 17 felony charges, carrying a maximum sentence of 275 years to life. But there was a problem. California's statute of limitations had expired on most of the charges. The clock had simply run out. However, prosecutors found a workaround. They charged him with torture and conspiracy to commit termination crimes with no statute of limitations. His accomplice, Santiago Lopez Gaitan, accepted a plea deal and received 17 years. Sun chose to fight. The trial in 2011 was emotionally devastating. The victim, now a mother of 4, testified about the lasting psychological wounds. "The post-traumatic stress disorder is with me daily," she told the court. "My 20s were stripped from my life." The jury deliberated and returned with a verdict: guilty of 1 felony count of torture. On September 9, 2011, Joe Sun was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. Random Task was going away for good, or so everyone thought. Just 1 month into his sentence at Wasco State Prison, correctional officers responded to a cell on B Yard at 5:25 p.m. Joe Sun stood at the door, washing his hands. His cellmate, 50-year-old Michael Graham, lay motionless on the lower bunk, his eyes and mouth open. He'd been beaten to death with bare fists. An autopsy confirmed multiple blunt force trauma. Son was charged with his cellmate's termination and, in 2017, was convicted of voluntary manslaughter, adding 27 more years to a sentence that already stretched beyond any reasonable hope of freedom. Today, Joe Son remains incarcerated in California, a convicted torturer and taker of life, serving what amounts to a natural life sentence. The man who once threw shoes in a comedy film now faces decades behind bars, and the next fighter on our list proves that even champions aren't immune to darkness. Number 3. Lee Murray. There are heists, and then there's the Securitas Depot robbery, one of the most audacious crimes in British history. At the center of it all was a cage fighter who proved just as dangerous outside the octagon as he was inside it. Lee Brahim Murray, known in the fighting world as Lightning Lee Murray, seemed destined for notoriety from the start. Born in London and raised between England and Morocco, Murray's life straddled two worlds. He wasn't just a street kid who found martial arts. He was a genuine talent. His mixed martial arts record of 8 wins, 2 losses, and 1 draw doesn't tell the full story. In 2004, he stepped into the Cage Rage promotion and defeated Jorge Rivera in the UFC with a slick arm triangle submission. He held victories over respected fighters like Chael Sonnen and even the legendary Mauricio Shogun Rua, Dana White. And the UFC brass saw potential. Murray was being groomed for bigger things. But Lightning Lee had another reputation one whispered about in London's underworld. Friends knew him as a street fighter, someone who settled disputes with his fists long before he ever competed professionally. He'd been involved in a notorious 2002 brawl outside a London nightclub that left several people hospitalized. Even as his fighting career gained momentum, Murray remained connected to a network of criminals involved in everything from substance distribution to organized theft. Then, in 2005, tragedy struck. Murray was stabbed multiple times in a brutal altercation that nearly claimed his life. The injuries were so severe he was forced to retire from competition. For most fighters, that would mean transitioning to coaching or commentary. Lee Murray had different plans. February 21st, 2006. The evening shift at the Securitas Depot in Tonbridge, Kent, was winding down. Manager Colin Dixon was driving home when a vehicle posing as an unmarked police car pulled him over. Men in realistic police uniforms approached, informing him of an incident at his residence. Concerned for his family, Dixon complied. What he didn't know was that his wife and young child were already being held hostage at their home by other members of the gang. The kidnappers made their demands crystal clear: cooperate or your family suffers. Dixon was driven back to the Securitas Depot, where he had access to one of the largest cash-holding facilities in the United Kingdom. Over the course of several hours, the highly organized crew loaded cage after cage of banknotes into waiting vehicles. 14 staff members were restrained but left unharmed. When the sun rose the next morning, the gang had vanished with £53 million in cash, the equivalent of roughly $85 million. It was meticulous, calculated, and it sent shockwaves through British law enforcement. The investigation was massive. Detectives from Kent Police worked around the clock, analyzing security footage, interviewing witnesses, and tracking financial transactions. Within weeks, they'd identified several suspects, low-level criminals with connections to organized theft rings. But the mastermind remained elusive. Then, investigators caught a break. Phone records and surveillance placed Lee Murray at the center of the conspiracy. He'd allegedly coordinated the entire operation, leveraging his connections between the UK and Morocco. There was just one problem. Murray had already fled to his father's homeland. Morocco became his sanctuary. The country has no extradition treaty with the United Kingdom, meaning British authorities couldn't simply drag him back to face justice. But Moroccan law allows prosecution of its citizens for crimes committed abroad. In June 2006, Moroccan police, working alongside Kent detectives, apprehended Murray in a shopping district in Rabat. He fought extradition for years, mounting legal challenge after legal challenge. Eventually, Morocco agreed to try him under their own jurisdiction. The trial stretched across multiple years. Prosecutors presented phone records, witness testimony from co-conspirators who'd been captured in the UK, and forensic evidence linking Murray to the planning stages. His defense argued insufficient proof, claiming he was merely in the wrong place at the wrong time. The judges weren't convinced. In 2010, Lee Murray was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in a Moroccan prison. That sentence was later extended to 25 years after appeals by prosecutors seeking harsher punishment. Today, Lee Murray remains incarcerated in Morocco, serving out a sentence in conditions far removed from the life he once imagined as a rising UFC star. He attempted escape once, using smuggled saws to cut through cell bars, but was quickly recaptured. The fighter who once electrified audiences with his speed and skill now sits in a foreign prison, his lightning reflexes useless against the slow grind of decades behind bars. But if you think a massive heist represents the darkest depth of MMA criminality, the next case will prove you devastatingly wrong. Number 4. Jarrod Wyatt. There are substances that promise enlightenment, a glimpse beyond the veil of ordinary consciousness. But sometimes, what awaits on the other side isn't transcendence, it's something far more terrifying. Jarrod Wyatt seemed to have everything figured out. The 26-year-old from Crescent City, California, had carved out a promising path in regional mixed martial arts. Standing 6'3" with an imposing frame, he'd just won his first professional bout in January 2010, competing under the Brass Knuckle Promotions banner. Those who trained with him described a dedicated athlete intense, focused, and driven to climb the ranks. He wasn't a household name yet, but he was building momentum. His best friend and regular training partner was Taylor Powell, a 21-year-old who shared Wyatt's passion for the sport. The two spent countless hours sparring, drilling techniques, and pushing each other to improve. They weren't just teammates. They were brothers. March 21, 2010. It was supposed to be a low-key evening at Wyatt's home near the mouth of the Klamath River. The plan was simple. The two friends would consume hallucinogenic mushroom tea to gather a decision that would alter both their lives forever. As the substances took effect, their perception of reality began to fracture. Witnesses would later report that the pair became fixated on apocalyptic delusions. They spoke of tidal waves approaching, of the world ending, of an epic confrontation between divine and demonic forces. In Wyatt's deteriorating mental state, he became convinced that Taylor Powell wasn't his friend anymore. He was something else entirely, something that needed to be stopped. What transpired over the next hours remains almost incomprehensible. Wyatt attacked Powell with savage ferocity, inflicting catastrophic injuries. When emergency responders arrived after a frantic 911 call, they discovered a scene that would haunt even veteran officers. Powell was found deceased on the couch, and the extent of the violence was immediately apparent. Wyatt himself stood nearby, unclothed and covered in blood. When deputies asked what happened, his response was chilling and direct. "I killed him." He explained in disjointed fragments that he'd been battling the devil himself. The investigation didn't require much detective work. The physical evidence was overwhelming, and Wyatt's own admissions left little room for doubt. But the medical examiner's report added a horrifying dimension to the case. Powell's internal organs had been removed while he was still alive, a detail so disturbing that prosecutors knew they were dealing with something beyond a typical homicide. The question wasn't whether Wyatt had ended his friend's life. It was whether he'd been in control of his faculties when he did it. Initially, Wyatt's attorney pursued a dual plea, not guilty, and not guilty by reason of insanity. Court-appointed psychiatrists evaluated him extensively, probing for evidence of psychosis or diminished capacity. If successful, the insanity defense could mean psychiatric treatment instead of prison. But in May 2012, the evaluation results came back. Despite the bizarre nature of the crime, doctors determined Wyatt was mentally competent to stand trial. He understood right from wrong. He could assist in his own defense. The insanity route had collapsed. Meanwhile, the prosecution had escalated the charges. Del Norte County District Attorney John Alexander refiled the case to include special circumstance allegations, aggravated mayhem, and torture. This elevated the charge to capital punishment territory, meaning Wyatt potentially faced execution or life without parole. The stakes couldn't have been higher. But Powell's family made an extraordinary decision. They didn't want Wyatt sentenced to termination. Despite their unimaginable grief, they requested the prosecution avoid seeking that ultimate penalty. 4 days before trial was set to begin in September 2012, both sides reached an agreement. Wyatt would plead guilty to first-degree ending of life involving mayhem. In exchange, he'd receive 50 years to life in state prison. His earliest possible parole hearing, 2062, when he'd be 79 years old. His attorney explained the logic. As bad as 50 years to life sounds, it's better than life without the possibility of parole. October 4th, 2012. The courtroom was packed as Judge William Follett prepared to formalize the sentence. Taylor Powell's mother, Kathy, addressed the court through tears. He tried to look tough, but deep down, he was like a big teddy bear. She said of her son, "Never did I imagine that his life would end this way." Wyatt himself showed little visible emotion as the sentence was read aloud. District Attorney Alexander told reporters afterward that there were no winners in this case, only the devastation of 2 families and 2 young lives permanently destroyed. Today, Jarrod Wyatt remains incarcerated in California, serving a sentence that will likely span the rest of his natural life. The fighter who once dreamed of championship glory now faces decades of confinement, haunted by a night when reality dissolved and friendship turned to tragedy. But while Wyatt's crimes were fueled by hallucinogens, our next fighter needed no such excuse for the violence he'd inflict. Number 5. Cain Velasquez. When a 2-time UFC heavyweight champion, a man celebrated for his discipline, humility, and dedication to family, suddenly becomes the subject of an attempted termination charge, the world takes notice. Cain Velasquez's fall from grace is a story of vigilante justice, a father's rage, and the catastrophic consequences of taking the law into your own hands. Cain Velasquez wasn't just any fighter. Born to Mexican immigrant parents in Salinas, California, he embodied the American dream through sheer determination and relentless work ethic. A standout wrestler at Arizona State University, he transitioned to mixed martial arts and quickly dominated the heavyweight division. In 2010, he captured the UFC Heavyweight Championship by defeating Brock Lesnar. He'd lose it, then reclaim it in 2012, cementing his legacy as one of the greatest heavyweights in the sport's history. His cardio was legendary. He'd push a pace that larger men simply couldn't match. Outside the cage, he was known as a devoted father and family man, someone who spoke passionately about his children and the values he hoped to instill in them. Fans adored him. Sponsors trusted him. He was the model of what a professional athlete should represent. February 2022. Cain Velasquez's 4-year-old son attended a daycare in the San Jose area, a place parents trusted to keep their children safe. But allegations emerged that would shatter that trust completely. Harry Goularte, a 43-year-old man connected to the daycare through his family's ownership, was arrested and charged with multiple counts of assault against a minor. The victim was Velasquez's young son. The details were disturbing, the kind that make any parent's blood run cold. Goularte was processed through the system and, in a decision that would prove catastrophic, was released from custody just days later. No bail was required. Instead, he was placed under house arrest and instructed to report to a monitoring facility to be fitted with an electronic tracking device. February 28, 2022. Goularte was traveling in a pickup truck driven by his stepfather, with his mother also present in the vehicle. They were en route to the monitoring appointment when another vehicle began pursuing them aggressively. Behind the wheel was Cain Velasquez. What happened next transformed a beloved champion into a criminal defendant. Velasquez opened fire on the truck not once, but multiple times. Bullets struck the vehicle as it sped through residential streets in a chase that stretched for 11 miles. One round found its mark, striking Goularte's stepfather in the arm and leaving him injured but alive. Miraculously, no one perished, but the damage was done. Law enforcement responded immediately. Velasquez was apprehended and taken into custody, facing a litany of serious charges: attempted termination of life, multiple counts of assault with a firearm, and shooting at an occupied vehicle. The Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office didn't mince words, describing his actions as a vigilante episode that endangered innocent lives. During the 11-mile pursuit, countless bystanders could have been caught in the crossfire. Velasquez's intent may have been focused on Goularte, but the execution put an entire community at risk. The case immediately divided public opinion. On one hand, prosecutors argued that no matter how understandable the rage, citizens cannot bypass the justice system and exact revenge with firearms. On the other, many sympathized with Velasquez's position as a father confronting the unthinkable. Petitions circulated, demanding his release. Fellow fighters, celebrities, and advocates spoke out, arguing that the system had failed him by releasing Goularte so quickly. For months, Velasquez remained behind bars as his legal team fought to secure bail. It took until November 2022, over 8 months, before a judge granted his release under strict conditions. The legal proceedings dragged on for years. Initially facing up to 40 years if convicted on all counts, Velasquez and his attorneys eventually negotiated a resolution. In August 2024, he entered a no-contest plea to attempted termination and related charges. The plea agreement spared him from a lengthy trial and the possibility of decades in prison, but it didn't spare him from consequences. March 25, 2025. Judge Arthur Bocanegra delivered the sentence: 5 years in state prison, with credit for time already served. Velasquez would be released after completing the remainder of his term, a fraction of what he could have faced, but still a significant penalty. His defense attorney called the outcome bittersweet, noting that while they'd hoped to keep him out of prison entirely, the sentence acknowledged the complexities of the situation. Cain has shown courage and strength of character, his lawyer stated. He has taken responsibility for his actions and has been held accountable. Today, Cain Velasquez serves his sentence in a California correctional facility, his fighting career definitively over. The man who once stood atop the UFC heavyweight division now faces the reality of incarceration, his legacy forever intertwined with a single afternoon when paternal fury overrode reason. Harry Goularte's case continues separately through the court system, a reminder that the legal process Velasquez attempted to circumvent is still grinding forward, just not on his timeline. But if Velasquez's crimes were driven by a father's protective instinct gone horribly wrong, the next fighter's actions reveal something far colder. Number 6. Hermes Franca. In combat sports, coaches and instructors hold positions of profound trust. Parents entrust them with their children, believing these authority figures will teach discipline, respect, and self-defense. When that trust is shattered, the betrayal cuts deeper than any physical wound. Hermes Franca seemed like the perfect success story. Born in Brazil, he'd risen through the ranks of mixed martial arts to achieve what most fighters only dream about. In 2007, he captured the World Extreme Cage Fighting Lightweight Championship, defeating Spencer Fisher in a performance that showcased his well-rounded skills. His base was built on Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, boxing, and wrestling, a dangerous combination that earned him a shot at UFC Gold. Though he fell short in a 2007 title bout against Sean Shirk, Franca remained a respected veteran with an impressive 2-3-1-6-1 record. He defeated notable opponents, including a young Nate Diaz, Jamie Varner, and Caol Uno. When his competitive career began winding down, he transitioned naturally into coaching, opening his own academy where he could pass on decades of accumulated knowledge to the next generation. But beneath the surface of the respected instructor lurked something sinister. Franca's academy attracted students of all ages, children, teenagers, adults, all seeking to learn from a legitimate UFC veteran. Parents saw his credentials and felt confident leaving their kids in his care. One family, in particular, enrolled their 14-year-old daughter, never imagining the nightmare that awaited. The allegations emerged in early 2011, though the incidents had reportedly occurred earlier. The teenage student came forward with disturbing claims about inappropriate contact that had taken place during private training sessions. What should have been a safe learning environment had become something else entirely. The details were deeply troubling, a pattern of boundary violations that prosecutors would later argue constituted predatory behavior. When investigators began digging, they discovered the accusations weren't isolated. There were multiple incidents, multiple occasions where Franca had allegedly exploited his position of authority. The Clackamas County authorities in Oregon launched a thorough investigation. Forensic interviews were conducted, evidence was gathered, witness statements were documented. The case against Franca grew stronger as investigators pieced together a timeline of escalating misconduct. In May 2011, facing the weight of the evidence, Franca made a decision. He turned himself in to authorities, a move his attorneys likely hoped would demonstrate cooperation and remorse. The charges were severe, multiple counts of unlawful contact with a minor. If convicted on all counts at trial, Franca faced the possibility of decades behind bars. The legal proceedings moved forward with prosecutors determined to hold him accountable, while his defense team sought the most favorable resolution possible. Eventually, negotiations produced a plea agreement. Franca would plead guilty to 1 count of attempted unlawful penetration and 1 count of first-degree inappropriate contact. In exchange, several other charges would be dismissed. The sentencing hearing laid bare the impact of his actions. Though the victim didn't testify publicly, her statement was presented to the court, describing the psychological harm and betrayal of trust. The judge considered the nature of the offenses, the age of the victim, and Franca's exploitation of his position as an instructor. The sentence came down: 42 months in state prison, 3.5 years, followed by supervised probation and mandatory registration requirements that would follow him for life. Franca's fall from grace was swift and complete. The MMA community, which had once celebrated his accomplishments, now distanced itself entirely. His name was scrubbed from promotional materials. His legacy as a WEC champion became forever tarnished by his crimes. Fellow fighters who'd once trained alongside him expressed disgust and disappointment, making clear that his actions didn't represent the values of martial arts or the sport they loved. Upon his release from prison in 2014, Franca faced a drastically different world. The coaching career was finished. His reputation was destroyed beyond repair. The registration requirements meant his crimes would follow him wherever he went, a permanent scarlet letter marking him as a predator. Some attempted comebacks in regional MMA promotions, but those efforts fizzled quickly as venues refused to associate with someone carrying his particular history. Today, Hermes Franca exists in obscurity, a cautionary tale about how power dynamics can be weaponized and how quickly a celebrated career can crumble when the truth emerges. The fighter who once competed on the sport's biggest stages now lives under the shadow of his crimes, serving a life sentence of social exile even after his prison term ended. But if Franca's crimes revealed a calculated predator hiding behind a respected facade, the next case shows what happens when privilege shields violence from consequences, at least for a while. Number 7. Cody East. Money can't buy happiness, but it can buy something almost as valuable to those who abuse it: second chances. For years, one fighter proved that wealth and family connections could shield even the most disturbing behavior until the bodies piled up and the excuses ran out. Cody East cut an imposing figure. Standing 6'3" and carrying the physique of a natural athlete, he dominated regional mixed martial arts circuits across New Mexico with an axe-side, impressive winning streak. His family background gave him advantages. Most fighters never enjoy financial resources for top-tier training, connections to promote his career, and the kind of safety net that allowed him to take risks. By his mid-20s, those wins caught the attention of UFC talent scouts. In 2008, he signed with the world's premier MMA organization, seemingly on the cusp of stardom. But East's problems had nothing to do with what happened inside the cage, and everything to do with what he did when the adrenaline wore off and the crowds went home. The warning signs appeared early. In 2006, East was arrested on domestic violence charges, accusations that painted a picture of someone with serious anger management issues, but prosecutors declined to pursue the case. Whether due to lack of evidence, witness cooperation problems, or other factors, East walked away without consequences. To those paying attention, it should have been a red flag. Instead, it became a pattern. July 2007, East decided to throw a party at his residence, an event that would expose the true extent of his violent tendencies. What started as a social gathering descended into chaos when East turned on his own parents. Witnesses reported him physically attacking his mother and father in their own home, a shocking display that left guests horrified. But the violence didn't stop there. East targeted younger attendees, using his martial arts training against defenseless teenagers. He grabbed multiple girls, aged 14 and 15, and executed judo-style hip tosses, throwing them forcefully to the ground, as if they were opponents in competition rather than children at a party. The injuries were immediate and painful, but miraculously, none of the girls suffered permanent damage. The rampage continued at subsequent gatherings. At another party, East confronted a 17-year-old boy. The details of what sparked the altercation remain unclear, but the outcome was undeniable. East used his size and training to overpower the teenager, applying a technique that resulted in a broken ankle. The young man required medical treatment and faced weeks of recovery. Friends and witnesses described East's behavior as unpredictable and frightening, someone who couldn't distinguish between sanctioned competition and social situations. Law enforcement finally intervened. The accumulation of incidents, combined with testimony from multiple victims, gave prosecutors a case too substantial to ignore. East was charged with several counts of assault against minors, felony charges that carried serious prison time. The evidence was overwhelming: medical records documenting injuries, witness statements corroborating the attacks, and a clear pattern of escalating violence. Yet even facing these charges, East's family resources came into play. High-powered attorneys were retained. Plea negotiations commenced. In December 2008, a deal was struck. East pleaded guilty to reduced charges and was sentenced to 3 years in state prison, a significant sentence, but far less than the maximum he could have received. The judge emphasized the seriousness of attacking children and exploiting his martial arts expertise against vulnerable victims. For a brief moment, it seemed justice had prevailed, but the story didn't end there. East served his time and was released, theoretically having paid his debt to society. His UFC career never materialized. He'd gone 0-2 before being cut, both losses coming by knockout. Yet the violence continued. In 2010, another domestic violence arrest. Once again, prosecutors didn't move forward. Then, in December 2016, yet another arrest on similar charges. The pattern was unmistakable. Privilege and family wealth kept providing escape hatches that would be unavailable to most defendants. Each time charges were dropped or reduced, East walked free to potentially reoffend. Victims watched their abuser avoid meaningful consequences, protected by a system that seemed more interested in second chances for the privileged than accountability for repeated violence. The MMA community largely distanced itself from East, recognizing that his behavior reflected poorly on a sport already fighting perception problems about attracting violent individuals. Today, Cody East's whereabouts and current legal status remains somewhat obscure. He's faded from public view, his fighting career long abandoned. But his case serves as a sobering reminder that athletic talent and family money don't erase criminal behavior. They just make it easier to hide for a while longer. The teenagers he injured carry those memories into adulthood, while East benefited from a justice system that gave him chance after chance that his victims never received. Yet if East represents justice delayed, our next fighter's crimes would shock an entire nation and spark international headlines. Number 8. Dmitry Sosnovskiy. In the sprawling landscape of Russian mixed martial arts, where fighters emerge from harsh backgrounds and limited opportunities, staying undefeated requires more than skill, it requires discipline. But for one promising heavyweight, the temptation of easy money proved far more seductive than the long road to championship glory. Dmitry Sosnovskiy was building something legitimate. The Russian heavyweight had compiled an undefeated record in regional MMA circuits, showcasing the kind of raw power and technical improvement that catches the attention of international promotions. He wasn't a household name yet, but in Russia's competitive fight scene, an unblemished record meant potential. Sponsorships, better opponents, perhaps even a contract with a major organization, all of it seemed within reach. He just needed to stay focused, keep training, and let his fists do the talking inside the cage. But Sosnovskiy had connections outside the gym, relationships that predated his fighting career. These weren't training partners or coaches. They were individuals involved in activities far removed from athletic competition men, who saw opportunities in Russia's complex business environment and weren't particularly concerned with legality. When they approached Sosnovskiy with a proposition, he faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. The target was a Russian businessman, someone with resources, someone who could be pressured. The plan was straightforward: abduction followed by extortion. Sosnovskiy and 4 accomplices would seize the man, hold him against his will, and demand payment of 300,000 rubles, approximately $4,000 US dollars at the time. It wasn't an enormous sum by international standards, but in certain Russian contexts, it represented significant money. The conspirators believed their victim would cooperate quickly, pay the ransom, and everyone could move on. They were catastrophically wrong. The kidnapping itself went according to plan. Sosnovskiy and his associates grabbed the businessman, transporting him to a secure location where he couldn't easily escape or call for help. They made their demands explicit: pay the 300,000 rubles or face dire consequences. Threats were issued. The possibility of harm, even termination, was made clear. The businessman found himself in an impossible situation, held captive by men who'd already demonstrated their willingness to use violence. But instead of capitulating to fear, the victim made a calculated decision. He played along, appearing to consider their demands while looking for any opportunity to escape. When Sosnovskiy and his fellow kidnappers left the room, perhaps to discuss strategy, perhaps simply out of carelessness, the businessman seized his chance. He managed to break free from his restraints and flee the location before they could react. Within hours, he'd contacted law enforcement, providing detailed descriptions of his captors and the location where he'd been held. Russian. Authorities moved swiftly. Kidnapping and extortion carry severe penalties under Russian criminal law, and cases involving violence against business figures receive particular attention. Investigators tracked down Sosnovskiy and the 4 other suspects, building a case through witness testimony, forensic evidence, and the victim's detailed account. The evidence was overwhelming. There was no question about who had committed the crime or what their intentions had been. The trial proceedings revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Prosecutors demonstrated that Sosnovskiy hadn't been a reluctant participant. Coerced into joining, he'd been an active collaborator in planning and executing the abduction. His physical capabilities as a trained fighter made him particularly valuable to the group, someone who could physically control the victim if resistance occurred. The defense argued for leniency, pointing to his previously clean record and promising athletic career, but the judge remained unmoved. The sentence came down with the full weight of Russian justice: 8.5 years in prison. For a fighter in his physical prime, it was a devastating blow. Those years represented the entirety of his competitive window, the time when he could have been building a legacy, earning championship belts, and establishing financial security through legitimate means. Instead, he'd be spending them behind bars, his undefeated record frozen in time, a permanent reminder of potential squandered. Today, Dmitry Sosnovskiy serves his sentence in a Russian correctional facility, his name occasionally surfacing in articles about athletes who threw away promising futures. The MMA community barely remembers him. He simply hadn't competed long enough to make a lasting impression. His victim, meanwhile, recovered from the psychological trauma of the ordeal and resumed his business activities, forever changed by an encounter with men who thought intimidation and violence were acceptable paths to quick money. Sosnovskiy's story serves as a stark reminder that athletic success requires more than physical talent. It demands judgment, patience, and the wisdom to recognize when opportunities are actually traps. An undefeated record means nothing if you're too imprisoned to defend it. But if Sosnovskiy's crimes reflected greed and poor judgment, the next fighter's actions would reveal something far more disturbing: a descent into ideology-fueled madness that shocked even hardened observers. Number 9. Viacheslav Datsik. Some fighters are remembered for championships, others for legendary bouts. And then there's Viacheslav Datsik, a man whose career became overshadowed by a spiral into violence, extremism, and behavior so erratic that distinguishing between genuine mental illness and calculated chaos became impossible. In the late 1990 seconds, Datsik was a legitimate force in Russian combat sports. The heavyweight compiled a respectable 15-6 record in mixed martial arts while simultaneously pursuing kickboxing, where he went 6-1. His most notable moment came in 1999 when he knocked out Andrei Arlovsky. Yes, the same Arlovsky who would go on to become UFC heavyweight champion. For a brief period, Datsik seemed destined for international recognition. He possessed knockout power, a willingness to engage, and the kind of aggressive style that excited promoters. But those who knew him personally recognized warning signs. His temperament was volatile, his worldview was darkening, and his associations were taking him down a dangerous path. The victories stopped coming. Losses accumulated. By the early 2000s, Datsik's fighting career had stalled, and rumors began circulating throughout Russian MMA circles. Some claimed he'd perished in a train accident, a story that spread widely enough that many fighters genuinely believed he was gone, but Viacheslav Datsik was very much alive. He'd simply found a different outlet for his violent tendencies. Between 2007 and 2010, a series of armed robberies terrorized mobile phone shops across Russia. The pattern was consistent. A large man would enter, brandishing a weapon, and demand cash and merchandise. The perpetrator showed no hesitation, no fear of consequences. Surveillance footage captured a figure matching Datsik's distinctive appearance, and witness descriptions aligned with the former fighter's physical characteristics. Law enforcement began connecting the dots, building a case that would eventually lead them directly to the ex-heavyweight. When authorities finally apprehended Datsik, the evidence was substantial. Multiple robberies, weapons violations, a clear pattern of escalating criminal behavior. But, during processing and evaluation, something else emerged: concerns about his mental state. Psychiatric professionals conducted assessments, probing for signs of disorders that might explain his actions. The diagnosis came back. Datsik was deemed mentally unfit for traditional incarceration. Instead of prison, he was committed to a psychiatric treatment facility where he'd supposedly receive care for his psychological issues. For most inmates, a psychiatric hospital would be preferable to prison. Not for Datsik. In 2010, he made a decision that would cement his reputation as one of MMA's most bizarre figures. Using nothing but brute strength and determination, he literally tore apart the metal fence surrounding the facility. The security measures designed to contain patients proved no match for a trained heavyweight fighter with motivation. He was free and he had a plan. Datsik fled Russia entirely, crossing into Norway illegally. Rather than hiding or maintaining a low profile, he sought out media attention. He arranged an interview with a local Norwegian news channel, a surreal moment where a fugitive psychiatric patient sat down for a recorded conversation. What he said during that interview shocked viewers and provided disturbing insight into his Beden's ideology. Datsik openly declared himself a supporter of extreme nationalist movements, espousing views that combined racism and authoritarian philosophy. He made no attempt to soften his statements or deny his beliefs. When asked about his identity, he clarified that he considered himself not merely a nationalist, but something far more troubling. The Norwegian authorities were watching. As soon as the interview concluded, law enforcement moved in. Datsik offered no resistance, in fact. He'd essentially turned himself in by appearing on television. He was immediately taken into custody, and extradition proceedings began. Russia wanted him back to complete his psychiatric treatment and face additional charges related to the escape. The case raised complex questions about mental health, criminal responsibility, and how justice systems handle individuals who exist in the gray area between sanity and disorder. Was Datsik genuinely suffering from psychological conditions that impaired his pacted Ezen judgment? Or was he manipulating the system, using mental health diagnoses to avoid harsher punishment? Experts disagreed, and the answers remained frustratingly unclear. Today, Viacheslav Datsik's current status is somewhat murky. Reports suggest he's been in and out of various facilities, with occasional sightings and bizarre social media posts that fuel speculation about his whereabouts. The Russian authorities keep him under watch, but his unpredictable nature makes him a perpetual wild card. The fighter who once knocked out a future UFC champion now exists as a cautionary tale about untreated mental illness, radicalization, and the dangers of allowing ideology to consume identity. His story serves as a stark reminder that the cage can only contain violence for 90 seconds at a time. What happens when that aggression has no outlet, no discipline, and no moral compass? You get Viacheslav Datsik, a man who could have been a champion but instead became a symbol of wasted. Series Spike TV's groundbreaking show that brought MMA into mainstream American households. Competing on Season 2 as a heavyweight, Whitehead became recognizable to casual fans, not just hardcore enthusiasts. Though he didn't win the tournament, the exposure launched his career to new heights. He fought for the UFC, competed internationally, and established himself as a respected veteran in a sport still finding its footing in popular culture. Sponsors came calling, training opportunities expanded. To those watching from outside, Mike Whitehead had achieved what most fighters only dream about. But behind the public persona, a darkness lurked that no amount of Octagon success could compensate for. In April 2010, Whitehead decided to host a barbecue at his residence, a casual gathering meant for friends and acquaintances to relax, enjoy food, and socialize. 2 young women attended, believing they were entering a safe environment among people they knew or had been introduced to. Through mutual connections, they had no reason to suspect the nightmare that awaited. As the evening progressed and guests mingled, Whitehead's behavior shifted. What started as normal hosting duties transformed into something predatory. The exact timeline remains known primarily through law enforcement reports and victim statements, but the allegations were deeply disturbing. According to prosecutors, Whitehead targeted the 2 female guests, exploiting the social setting and likely their impaired ability to consent or resist. The charges that would eventually be filed painted a picture of calculated assault, someone using their position as host to isolate and victimize vulnerable guests. One victim's ordeal was particularly severe. Prosecutors alleged that what happened to her went beyond assault. It constituted forcible acts that left lasting physical and psychological trauma. The second woman faced her own horrifying experience, though the specific nature of the allegations varied. Both victims eventually came forward, a courageous decision that survivors of such crimes know carries its own painful consequences, reliving trauma, facing skepticism, and enduring invasive questioning. The investigation by local authorities began shortly after the incident was reported. Detectives interviewed witnesses who'd attended the barbecue, documented the victims' accounts, and collected forensic evidence. The case against Whitehead grew stronger as investigators pieced together the events of that April evening. Medical examinations corroborated aspects of the victims' statements. Witness testimony placed Whitehead with the accusers during critical timeframes. The evidence pointed toward a pattern of predatory behavior that prosecutors believed warranted serious charges. Mike Whitehead was arrested and formally charged with multiple counts of assault against the two women. The initial charges were severe. Prosecutors filed counts that reflected the gravity of the allegations and the potential for decades of imprisonment if convicted. News of the arrest sent shockwaves through the MMA community. Fellow fighters who'd trained with Whitehead expressed disbelief, while others noted that his behavior outside the gym had raised occasional red flags that were too easy to dismiss or ignore. As the case moved toward trial, the legal complexities became apparent. Defense attorneys would argue consent, challenge the credibility of witnesses, and attempt to create reasonable doubt. Prosecutors would need both victims willing to testify and endure cross-examination, a requirement that proves insurmountable in many assault cases. The victims faced an agonizing decision: proceed with prosecution and relive their trauma publicly, or decline to participate and watch their assailant potentially walk free. The ultimate resolution of Mike Whitehead's case remains somewhat obscured by time and limited public records, but the damage to his reputation and career was immediate and irreversible. The UFC and other major promotions severed ties. Sponsors disappeared. The fighter who'd once been featured on national television became persona non grata in the sport he dedicated his life to building. Today, Mike Whitehead's legacy is permanently tarnished, a cautionary reminder that athletic achievement means nothing when measured against the harm inflicted on innocent people. His victims carry scars that no court verdict can heal, while the MMA community continues grappling with how to identify and remove predators before they can exploit the trust that comes with fame. These 10 cases represent just a fraction of the violence that spilled beyond the cage, a sobering look at what happens when discipline, respect, and humanity are abandoned. And they serve as a permanent reminder: combat sports can teach control, but they can't create character. That has to come from within.